Namaskar and welcome to Diplomatic Dispatch with me, your host Vikas Swarup. The India Energy Week in Bengaluru, held from February 6 to 8, marks the first major event under India's G20 Presidency. So, in this edition of our program, we will discuss the challenges of energy security and environmental sustainability and India's roadmap to achieve a target of net zero emissions by 2070. Energy has been globally recognized as one of the most critical inputs for a nation's progress. Economic growth and social development are primarily dependent on availability of energy at affordable prices. The evidence shows a direct correlation between energy consumption and economic prosperity. India is projected to witness the largest increase in energy demand of any country as it moves to become the third largest economy by 2030, overtaking Japan and Germany. According to the International Energy Agency, energy demand in India will grow at more than 3% on an annual basis, aided by rapid urbanization and industrialization. And that is why ensuring energy security remains one of the most important foreign policy priorities of the government. Under Prime Minister Modi in particular, energy diplomacy has become crucial in our quest for sustainable and rapid economic growth. At a time when the world is in the midst of a global energy crisis, created by geopolitical tensions, climate change, supply chain disruptions, and the after effects of the COVID-19 pandemic, India's energy transition will play a pivotal role in global energy markets. To learn more about the energy landscape in India and the world and assess future trends, I am now joined by two outstanding experts. Dr. Arunabha Ghosh is founder CEO of the Council on Energy, Environment and Water, which is rated among the world's 20th best climate think tanks. He also serves on the Government of India's G20 Finance Track Advisory Group, advises the Sherpa Track for India's G20 Presidency, and serves on the UN Secretary General's high-level expert group on net zero commitments of non-state actors. Mr. Narendra Taneja is chairman of the Independent Energy Policy Institute, the founder-president of the World Energy Policy Summit, visiting professor at the NTPC School of Business in India, and a leading commentator on national and international energy issues. A very warm welcome to both of you. Let me begin with you, Dr. Ghosh. Now, you have just returned yourself from Bengaluru, where you were attending the India Energy Week. How do you assess the global energy landscape, and how has it been impacted by the Russia-Ukraine war?
First of all, many thanks for having me on the show. The first thing we have to recognize about the global energy landscape is that it is being disrupted. It is being disrupted by here and now events, and it is being disrupted by long-term move towards a low-carbon pathway. Now, if you consider that the main shift, the main disruption in global energy markets this decade and for the next 2 to 3 decades is how countries like India and other emerging markets will become the drivers of energy demand. Now, as that happens, as they integrate more closely into global energy markets, when earlier they were on the margins and now they will drive that demand, their energy security concerns become paramount. However, there is in parallel, as you asked, the challenge of what is happening with the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Now, one of the things that has happened as a result, for instance, is that Europe has reduced its import of pipeline gas, but it has not eliminated its import of LNG from Russia or elsewhere. So what is happening is that the LNG markets are getting further disrupted. So as India, which relies more on LNG rather than pipeline gas, has to compete with suppliers, but also compete with other demanders, this is becoming a matter of grave concern. Because as we try to engage in long-term contracts, as we try to sign more deals at a particular price to avoid the disruption in prices, we are now competing with new sources of demand in that space. And finally, what is happening is that there is also in the move towards a low carbon pathway, which is desirable for the planet and desirable for India's energy security, there will be medium term disruptions, which is related to who's actually going to invest for the oil and gas production, exploration and production in the near term, because we still need the oil and gas here and now. So I see these three as kind of major areas of attention. How do we ensure that emerging markets like India play a more important role in the disruptions that are happening? How do we secure the supplies when new sources of demand are emerging? And how do we balance out the challenges now versus the move towards a low carbon future while maintaining a steady flow of investment in these sectors?
Let me pick up the point on energy security that he mentioned. Now, Mr. Taneja, why is energy security now a strategic imperative for India? And what are the challenges that you foresee related to India's energy security?
Well, when you look at India, especially the geographical parking of India, size of India, the other economic complexities, there's two basically sides of that energy security challenge. Number one is domestic. We're a democracy and we still have large number of people who don't have access to affordable energy. There are people like us here in the studio. We have got 3-4 air conditioners running in our, in our places and offices and all that. So we live more or less the same kind of life as people in the global north in terms of energy consumption. But we still have a large number of Indians, our brothers and sisters, fellow Indians, who don't have access to that kind of energy. In Bihar, for instance, even today, only 10% people have access to refrigerators. In India, in total, about only 30%. I'm not talking of air conditioners. So that's the kind of situation. So in a democracy, if you're not able to mobilize sufficient energy for these people, it's a threat to your energy security in the context of internal challenges. Then there is an external challenge. So right now, our dependence on import is very, very high. We import roughly 85% of our total requirement of oil, 60% of total requirement of natural gas, even coal, some quantity we import, and uranium, we import a substantial quantity of uranium. When it comes to solar, we import roughly 85 to 89% of these panels, equipment, cells, and so on and so forth. So when you look at the kind of, our geographical parking, challenges we have from the north, challenges we have from the Indian Ocean side, it's important that we should not be depending or we should not be so vulnerable. We are, if you look at the large economy of the world, we are the most vulnerable economy in terms of energy. So we need to work on it. So of course, one way to work on is this, that we try to find more oil, gas, build bridges, and so on and so forth. But I think that's not going to be helpful. We have to build a kind of economic order, domestic economic or energy order, which is self-sufficient, which is based on our own strength, which is based on our own capital, and if possible, based on our own technologies. So I think that's the challenge. So energy security has different meaning for different geographies. For Saudi Arabia, it's securing demand. For us, it's securing supply. For Russia, maybe energy surplus, but even Russia is not energy independent because for them, they must be able to sell in order to sustain their, their economy. So I think energy security is one thing where the definition differs from, change. Within India, energy security has a different meaning for residents of Delhi and Bombay because they're affluent. It is a completely different meaning for people living in Jhakarpur in Bihar.
Now, Dr. Ghosh, the India Energy Week was preceded by the first G20 Energy Transition Working Group meeting, which was held under India's presidency. Now, the G20 has been championing the cause of global cooperation in clean energy transition and has made it central to the agenda of sustainable economic development. Where does India fit into this picture? What kind of a leadership is India providing to this process?
Energy and sustainable energy is very much front and center of India's G20 agenda as part of its presidency. When we think about what kind of leadership it needs to provide or is providing, I see it in a few different buckets. Number one, what Mr. Taneja also just mentioned, we have to look after energy security from the point of view of the economy, but also from the point of view of the citizens. Now, over the last 7-8 years, India has massively increased access to energy for hundreds of millions of citizens. But globally, there are still about 700 million people without access to electricity, 2 billion people without access to clean cooking fuel. So one of the things that India is trying to show attention to is what are the ways in which we can increase access to energy for the hundreds of millions of people that are energy deprived. The second thing is what is related to the security of supply, not just of the energy sources for today, but what we call the fuels of the future. That includes the access to critical minerals that often go into a lot of the clean technologies. That includes access to components that go into, say, our solar panels or our hydrogen electrolyzers or our wind turbines. So establishing an energy security order that responds to the fuels of the future for the economies that will drive energy demand in the future is a second priority. A third priority is establishing, related to this, resilient supply chains for energy. So today we know where we get oil from and gas from, but the future energy markets will be even more dispersed and distributed. So how do you build resilient and reliable supply chains in this matter? And then, of course, how do you cooperate on developing new energy technologies? These are some of the key themes around which we are structuring the conversation in the Energy Transitions Working Group under the G20 presidency.
Now, in his address at the inauguration of India Energy Week, Prime Minister Modi said that India's strategy for the energy sector is centered around four major verticals: increase in domestic exploration and production of oil and gas, diversification of energy supplies, expansion of alternative sources of energy like biofuels, ethanol, compressed biogas, and solar energy, and achieving decarbonization through electric vehicles and green hydrogen. I want to unpack each of these four verticals. Now, Mr. Taneja, let's begin with oil, an area in which you have particular expertise. India, as you said, is the world's third largest consumer of crude oil and depends on imports to meet over 85% of its needs. Costly oil imports naturally result in heavy foreign exchange outflows for the country. So what are we doing to increase domestic exploration and production of oil and gas, which you have yourself said is a difficult task?
You see, when it comes to fossil fuels, oil, gas is the same molecule as, or coal for that matter. Either you are blessed with or you're not blessed with. It's given by nature. You see, so we can't really help much. But we still have some potential in deep water and ultra deep water in the Bay of Bengal in particular, but also in Kerala, Konkan area, and also south of Gujarat, and also Bombay offshore. We still have some potential there. And I think we are trying our level best. We have also now opened up the sector, and biggies of the world like ExxonMobil and BP and Shell, they're all looking at India and joining hands with Indian exploration and production E&P players. But you look at the demand. We consume roughly 5.2 million barrels of oil every day. Per day. And it's going to go up to 7 million barrels, whether we like it or not. We have to sustain our economy. Not only at this level, we have to take it up to 10% per annum growth. If we have to kind of, ensure that Asia of tomorrow is multipolar, which means it's not dominated by China, there's not one hegemon, then it's important that we grow as fast as possible. The best way we can ensure the future of Asia is multipolar is for India to grow at least at 20%, 10% per annum for next 20 years, uninterrupted. That is the best energy security that you can go for. And oil is still going to play a large role. 2050 and beyond is all going to be about renewables, nuclear, hydrogen, solar, and so forth. But the challenge for us is that how do we cover this gap between 2023 and 2050? And there, oil will continue to play an important role. Gas will continue to play an important for maybe next 25 years. Even coal will be playing an important role for next 15 to 17 years. While, for instance, renewables will grow. Right now, the share of renewables in India's energy mix is rather small. Globally, it's less than 10%. You see, if you take the hydropower out. Now, that is a reality. So for us, what is more important? Most important thing is that we must grow at 10%. And for next 20 years, we cannot compromise that. If we compromise with that, the future of India as a country will be under threat. We have to understand it. So while we deal with climate change and all those things, we also have to understand for that we must survive as a nation. We must do well economically. If we are not able to deliver, 10% growth rate, or we are not able to get, let's say, 25 to 30 trillion dollar economy by 2047, look, we have compromised with our future. We will have no option but to become subservient to China. And even Japan might be in the same boat. That's going to disrupt the entire thing, not only geopolitically, even geoeconomically, and future of India as a country. Therefore, on that, we should not compromise. Right now, the global agenda for climate, global agenda for energy, all dominated by Global North, actually written by them. They are the author, they control it. Now only, thanks to our Prime Minister, who understand energy very well, that now India has started playing a big role in terms of, recasting the global agenda. You're going to see that in coming months. Now, you saw that in Bali. Before that, you saw it at G7 in Germany. So I think India is lucky to have a Prime Minister like him, who understand energy sector just like an energy person.
Now, Dr. Ghosh, when it comes to diversification of energy supplies, how's India going about it?
Well, the first thing we have to understand is that there's diversification for different kinds of diversification, different kinds of energy supplies. When it comes to oil and gas, our primary providers have been West Asian countries.
Yes.
Now, the real challenge that has emerged is basically in the context of the gas supplies, because we have this long-term contract with Qatar. And now that the European countries have lined up, we are struggling to actually get the price at which we would have preferred, because the Europeans are now willing to pay a premium. So we have to now look carefully in terms of not just Qatar, but elsewhere where we can get alternative sources of gas, even as we have also looked at, Russian oil and so forth. But the other thing that has happened is we should be careful about, and Ms. Taneja also referred to this, our estimation at CEW is that our oil demand in the transport sector alone will keep rising until 2050, even as we massively shift towards renewables. But the transport sector, there will be a rise. In fact, there will be a 50% increase in demand. So how do we leverage the locomotive role that India will play in the global energy markets for better prices? Right? What do I mean by this? Is that we will now drive the growth in energy markets, which means we have a bit of the buyer's power, even as we have to look for alternative sources. Now, when it comes to the cleaner energy materials, etc., there again, if you see in the last 2-3 years, the big push towards what are called performance-linked incentive schemes, because we have deployed solar, we've deployed wind, but now we have moved from 80% import of oil to 80% import of solar panels. That is not a recipe for energy security either. So we have to build out the clean energy infrastructure, but also ensure that either we make that clean energy infrastructure at home or find alternatives. So one of the things that India is doing is mapping out in that renewable energy supply chains, what are the alternatives to China? Is it from Europe? Is it from other parts of Asia? Is it from US? What are the components? If you take a hydrogen electrolyzer, within that there is something called the membrane. One of the critical components of the membrane, there's one supplier in the world. In another technology, also a critical interconnector in the electrolyzer, there's one supplier in the world. Now, this is not an architecture for energy security. So, bottom line is this, that today we are having this discussion in 2023. 50 years ago, after the first oil shock, the International Energy Agency was created. But it responded to the energy demands of the energy demanders of the past, the global north. We don't have an energy security architecture for the energy demanders of the future or the energy fuels of the future.
Speaking of that new architecture, now, Mr. Taneja, Prime Minister Modi just launched the sale of 20% ethanol blended petrol on a pilot basis by public sector oil marketing companies. How will E20, as this new fuel is going to be called, help our transition?
Well, in a significant way, and because let's not forget, we already have 10% ethanol blending. Now the target is, 20%. And it's important to remember that it's only in petrol. There is no blending in diesel. And diesel is the big boy. It's roughly 45%. Petrol is only 10%. So, and more people are moving actually to diesel. Even in cities, you see more diesel, fired SUVs and so on and so forth. So, but it's still a very good move, and is helping agriculture, is helping cut, import dependence and so on and so forth. But, for us, the challenge is so huge. We need to do whatever we can. What basically, if you look at the Prime Minister's speech in the Bangalore, what Prime Minister is trying to achieve for India is energy independence, if I may put it in one term. Like the US has just achieved energy independence, only recently. So Prime Minister basically, when you look at carefully, read it carefully, read between the lines and all that, that's what he wants. He wants by 2047 India to be energy independent. Even Russia may be energy surplus, but it's not energy independent because it's heavily dependent on exports. Saudi Arabia is not energy surplus, but not energy independent. What Prime Minister basically was talking about a vision, which is basically would make India energy independent. You see, so what is important, my sense is that, if we really want to kind of build a new architecture for energy, and where countries like India, China, Brazil, Indonesia can play a bigger role, I think it is time for us to sit across the table with the global north and and the United Nations, and try to build a new intergovernmental organization for energy. We have dedicated organization for health, for culture, for practically everything. But we don't have one for the most important sector of the global economy, that's energy. Question is why? Because there are some people, they don't want it. But I think India should join hands with China, with Indonesia, with Brazil, and like-minded countries, even in the global north, try to build a global organization, with its DNA is this new architecture, and it should be headquartered somewhere in this part of the world. By the way, it's important to remember the global gravity center of energy has moved from the Atlantic to the Indo-Pacific. But the global north and the Atlantic country, they are still refusing to acknowledge it. So the future, all this challenge to create a new architecture is going to be interesting. But let me tell you, not easy.
Dr. Ghosh, now coming to the expansion of alternative sources of energy, how do you see India's energy mix changing over the next 2 decades? And can we really end our reliance on coal, which accounts for what, 70% of our thermal energy?
We see that, for say, in the power sector, the coal demand will continue to be, coal will continue to be the mainstay of the energy, of the power sector. Let's talk about energy in a second. At least until the early 2030s. After that, there is a plateauing, and then there is a decline. So the real decline really begins to happen, close in the 2040s. Meanwhile, the solar, wind, etc., will keep growing. So today we had promised for 2030 that more than 40% of our electricity capacity will be renewables. By 2021 itself, we had reached that target. We are now at 42%. I think by 2030, and now with Prime Minister's new promise of 500 gigawatts of non-fossil capacity by 2030, I see that will be a major disruption, because India will be the first major economy in the world that will build out more clean energy infrastructure than its entire electricity system as it exists today. This kind of a pathway no one has charted before. So then countries will be looking to India to learn those lessons. But coal is not used only in the power sector. Coal is also used for steel, for making cement, for fertilizer. Now, these heavy industries is also the mainstay and strategic industries in any major economy. That is where the green hydrogen mission becomes extremely important. India's green hydrogen mission, which the Union Cabinet approved in January, and which Honorable Finance Minister allocated more than 19,000 crore for in the budget, is on paper at least the world's largest green hydrogen mission. 5 million tons per annum by 2030, which will be half of the entire EU's domestic production of green hydrogen. To make all of this happen, we need investment.
So speaking of investment, Mr. Taneja, Prime Minister Modi also urged global investors to explore opportunities in India's energy sector. Where do these opportunities lie?
Well, good question. I think, it's still a lot of opportunity in the conventional energy. That includes coal. We're talking of green coal, using and, producing gas using coal, coal-based basically gases, and exploration production in deep water and ultra deep water. Also the new area which we have now opened up, Andaman Nicobar. Andaman Nicobar area is supposed to be floating on natural gas. That's what some geologists claim. And at the same time building the gas pipeline infrastructure within the country, and joining hands with biggies from the western part of the world, for that matter, whosoever is interested, and acquiring oil, gas and coal assets overseas, wherever we can. Let me give you an example. We have invested $18 billion in oil and gas in Russia alone.
Yes.
And we have also allowed them to invest $13 billion, and they own, practically own the entire refinery called Nayara refinery in Jamnagar. So we need to kind of, go, and we have to attract companies like Saudi Aramco or ADNOC and ExxonMobil and all these companies to come and invest in India. And if they can't, join hands with them in different geographies. Because if it's oil owned by us, whether in Russia or in Africa or Latin America, then that's equity oil. That's our oil. Like China, when you look at China, China produces 10 million barrels of oil every day. And half of these assets are actually located outside China. So I think we need to continue to invest in that, in India or overseas, but as long as assets are owned by us or owned jointly together with them. Number one. Number two is that, we need to, as Mr. Ghosh also pointed out, we need to build this ecosystem for renewables, hydrogen and solar, which means we have talked about setting up gigafactories, which is fantastic. But we need 8 or 10 such factories. We have to become a kind of a global hub for technology, for hydrogen, for solar, for wind, even for oil exploration, production, and even coal. We should be the hub. We are using this for our domestic consumption, and at the same time, we are basically, using it for exports. So I think the important thing is that we need to see the same way. Let me give you an example. In Germany, they spent 20 years building this model on transition, basically from fossil fuels or conventional fuel to renewable. Just one misstep, a mistake by Mr. President Putin, the entire model that Germany has built and talked about for 20 years went out of the window.
And they are reopening mothballed coal plants.
Exactly, importing coal.
Correct.
Talking about nuclear power plants once again. Now the point is, whenever we make this vision, let's not forget, in energy sector is one where you will always be dependent on other countries and other geographies and the geopolitical and geo-economical triggers.
One point to what Mr. Taneja was saying, I think one of the things that is not being noticed is that oil exploration and production in oil and gas, the core investment of that actually comes from global north oil majors, the independents and the oil majors. The production side comes, there's more from the state-owned oil companies. Now, as the global north moves for their domestic political reasons, moves more towards sustainability, etc., we are seeing investments from those companies go down. Now, that will create an energy security problem because to dig up the oil, you have to first explore it. So here is an opportunity for India to tie up with some of the majors in West Asia to fill that investment gap. And in the process, we will also then own the assets that emerge as a result.
India is also taking the lead to promote a regional approach to energy cooperation and working with countries like Bangladesh, Bhutan, Nepal, and Myanmar. Do you see the possibility of a common energy grid in the future?
Honorable Prime Minister announced this, and during the Glasgow Climate Conference in 2021, this whole story around OSOWOG, one sun, one world, one grid. The point is the sun is shining somewhere or the other in the world. But India is trying to leverage its leadership through the International Solar Alliance to also bring the energy security dimension to this. So the point is electrons can also be transported. Of course, you lose some electrons in the transmission, but if you use high voltage direct current lines, you can actually efficiently transport electrons over a long distance. That actually allows you to tap into different kinds of renewable energy sources. So if India is abundant in sunshine, and Bhutan is abundant in hydro, or Nepal is abundant in hydro, and Southeast Asia is abundant around the coasts in wind, the point is then when the sun is shining, and when the wind is blowing, and when the water is flowing, could be different times of the day. Now to make that happen, you need investment, you need infrastructure, but most importantly, you need trust.
On that note, we have to bring this discussion to a close. Thank you very much for sharing your insights with our viewers. The Russia-Ukraine war and subsequent weaponization of energy systems has yet again highlighted the importance of ensuring energy security. India's energy policy framework is based on 4 A's: availability, accessibility, affordability, and acceptability. Even as it faces the twin challenges of meeting the aspirations of its 1.3 billion population while also safeguarding its energy security, India is actively contributing to global efforts to mitigate climate change. India's G20 presidency will help advance the agenda for a sustainable, clean and green future for the country and the planet. Thank you for watching Diplomatic Dispatch. Till we meet again next week, take care and goodbye.